Bisognerà forse abbassare un po' le luci, se no
Come si fa lì?
sì, no, senza diventarlo. Prova, prova.
Sì.
Perché io ce l'avevo, altrimenti l'avevo nel computer in stanza.
Serve aiuto?
Sì, l'ho pronto perché non volevo fare. Penso che forse...
Dovrei fare slide principali lunedì per padella. No, parla questo. Posso parlare questo? Ok, perfetto. Io adesso 2 minuti per vedere che tutto, anche di più, per vedere che tutto. Fammi. Non ci sono le viti?
No, non ci
Ah,
ti ricordi che non funzionavano
è vero.
l'altra volta? Adesso qui vediamo se funzionano, dovrebbe
Questo
funzionare.
funziona?
Non ho guardato.
Si scoprirà tutto. Aspetta che togliamo questa.
Possiamo magari controllare anche se funziona questo.
Lo fai tu questo? Qua, per... Io
Eh,
sono Windows 10 adesso.
Funziona l'audio?
sì, l'audio l'audio.
Il video? Cioè io ho un video.
Possiamo, come si dice, possiamo
Lo puoi mettere sul desktop.
no, dovrebbe funzionare perché sappiamo, avevamo provato a fare delle chiamate Hangout se funzionava, quindi però magari facciamo una prova per sicurezza.
Io metto sul desktop.
L'importante è che si ricordi di provare.
Sì, sì.
questo è l'USB-C e quindi non potrai neanche...
Ecco. Questo è un SPP.
Sì, perché questo è un USB normale. Se no lei preferirebbe presentare dal suo computer, posso forse cercare di capire se è possibile trovare...
Ma dove riuscire?
Come va? Io non... Scusa, era messa in una presentazione di così? Se no 20 minuti. Quindi direi... non so se è anche su un drive o... Se no possiamo vedere come la cambierebbe lui, se riesce a riparare qualcosa. Se diciamo repair, cosa succede? Se magari una volta scorsa che non era strano. Non dovrei l'impianto. Magari poi quando c'è il coso basta che
Esatto, lo
sposta
passo.
questo qua in maniera più flessibile, ad esempio in
Tanto sono un... Non so perché me l'ha anche eliminato. Tanto
però è questo del 931, sì.
Esatto.
Hello, fine, how do you sleep? Well, thank you. Ah, ok. Ti metto qua?
Sì. Spotify sì.
Come si fa? Metti anche schermo intero. Come fai se schermo intero? Com'è? Tu l'avevi fatto prima di mettere schermo intero, no?
Sì.
Dove si fa?
È CTRL L. Alt F4 è presente su Windows, chiudo il programma.
Non si smette mai di imparare.
Most important shortcut in my life.
Puoi per favore controllare se funziona questo coso? Con
Quale?
una presentazione qualsiasi?
Sì. Lasciate attaccato perché devo vedere come si vede lo schermo dal live stream. Però devo fare...
Metti una presentazione.
Vabbè, l'ho
metti-
staccato, vado dopo. Solo per questo un attimo.
Funziona.
Acceso. Ma questo è a Roma?
Eh?
No, questo è esterno. Oddio,
No, non funziona. Certo.
da qui o da sotto? Dove lo ritrovo?
Forse da sotto sarebbe meglio. Te le porto io uno se non funziona.
Secondo me bisogna accenderlo. Connect.
È quello che ho schiacciato anche prima, ma...
Elisa gioca alle presentazioni. Comincia vedi questo, funzione il computatore laser di questo? Sì, allora
Proviamo a schiacciare questa cosa, no?
non ne serve il software del computer, proviamo? Secondo me c'è il software di questo che si accende. Vabbè, ma bisogna solo accendere il programma.
Prova se vuoi, tanto ci mettiamo poco tempo.
Sì. Come si chiama questa cosa?
Edo, tu nelle presentazioni che hai visto qua, perché non sono sempre già visto.
Non so se scarico, l'hai provato.
No, non è scarico
Funziona il
perché...
puntatore ma non funziona il...
Ah, quello per
puntatore
passare. Quello centrale. Non funziona per passare il secondo.
no, ed è on.
Mi sento come una...
Non c'è tipo un Bluetooth che pone...
Prova a vedere dentro cosa succede effettivamente quando
Ah,
abbassi
sì.
solo le pile, no?
non penso che ci sia.
Non ci sono... No, no.
Questo allora... No.
No, no.
Non c'è da...
Technician? Possiamo provare a vedere? Anche ho provato a premere il numero
No,
per
adesso...
connette.
Vabbè, dai, io adesso comincio. Non è così fondamentale comunque.
No, sì, se c'era era meglio.
Proviamo a vedere se c'è qualche icona per... Prova a vedere sul desktop.
Tu dici di guardare sul desktop?
Eccoci qua.
no, questo è un remote simulator. Non credo sia un... Spegni Spotify pure. C'è aperto Spotify.
No, non ho aperto, mi è sempre aperto.
Meglio chiudere in caso parte una canzone a caso a metà presentazione.
Va bene, dai, mettiamo...
Ok.
Abbiamo acceso tutto?
Sì,
Ah, ok.
Come faccio a togliere questa roba?
vede questi lì? Ma non si vede? Ah, sì, si vede. Ho messo me la L.
Vabbè, lasciamo, ok. Sì. Tu stai qua con me o no? Stai... Okay, I think we're ready to make a start. A very good morning to everyone in the room. Thank you for making it here so early on a Saturday morning. Do take a seat if you're still coming in while I get us started with the welcomes. My name is Jacopo Russo, and on behalf of the whole organizing committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Science, Policy and the Public in Italy. It's a full-day conference exploring the relationship between researchers, policymakers, and society in Italy. The event is organized by the Cambridge University Italian Society, of which I am the treasurer, in collaboration with the Association of Italian Scientists in the UK. And it's the first event of its kind organized by an international society in Cambridge, which is why I'm so excited to see so many of you here in this beautiful and inspiring setting here at the Old Divinity School at St. John's College. Our goal for today is to provide an opportunity for engagement and interaction between UK-based researchers and Italian policymakers, and to stimulate a discussion on the opportunities, on the way researchers and experts can best advise policymakers and communicate their knowledge to the public. Today's presentations and discussions will focus on three themes: environment and infrastructures, public health and biotechnologies, and digital technologies. We're lucky to be joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers, and we hope that the discussions will highlight the opportunities and the challenges in the relationship between researchers, science advisors, journalists, and decision makers. I'm particularly excited about the work that young researchers have prepared for today. 8 of them will be presenting a review of the available evidence around a key policy issue. And there will be a session just before lunchtime for them to present briefly their poster. And then over lunch, be sure to go downstairs to the central hall where lunch will be served. And that's where the posters will be. Now, on to some practical info. You can find a digital version of the conference booklet in an email sent to you via Eventbrite earlier this week. Or you can visit our homepage and just scroll down until you find it in a PDF form. There are some physical copies lying around the room. Please resist the temptation of taking them with you home. I know they're extremely beautiful, but we have limited copies of them, so if you could please share amongst you, that'd be great. And as you can read from the programs posted outside the room, we have 2 coffee, a morning and an afternoon coffee, as well as lunch provided at 12:15, I think, or after that. If you decide to leave at any point during the day and then realize how big a mistake it was and how many presentations you're missing out on, please show your badge at the entrance so that you can come back in. I would also like to inform you that we are going to record the event and to take photography during the day. The hashtag to post anything on social media is SPP Italy. Please do share your thoughts with us on your favorite platform as you listen to the discussions of the day, because we're hoping to produce a report of this event, and it would be great if we could include some quotes from the audience and include some of your thoughts and comments on the discussions. Before I pass the word to Professor Antonio Guarino, President of the Association of Italian Scientists in the UK, there are a few people and organizations I would like to thank. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Meroni Technology, Integer, and PM Farmaceutici, for generously sponsoring the event, because obviously none of this would have been possible without their support. And I would also like to thank the Italian Embassy in London and the British Embassy in Rome, as well as the UK Science and Innovation Network for partnering with us to make this event a wonderful science diplomacy opportunity. Finally, thanks to all of you for being here and enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacopo. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Antonio Guarino. I am the president of the Association of Italian Scientists in the UK. What is that? In the United Kingdom, there are many non-British scientists, and the Italian community is probably the first, the largest, or maybe the second after the German, of the non-British European scientists in this country. So we are present in all disciplines, from life sciences to physical sciences and engineering to social sciences and humanities. We are present in all, in many universities, from Cambridge to Oxford, to the universities in London, to Edinburgh, and so on and so forth. The association obviously doesn't have all the 5,000 people. One day we'll get there. At the moment we are probably 600, 700 people. And what do we do? Events like this one, where we try to engage with the public so that scientists are not just in their tower. And also events to promote the exchange between the United Kingdom and Italy and the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, because in science we don't like barriers at all. Jacopo has already thanked many, I think you forgot the Italian ambassador in London and the British ambassador in Rome, because the two embassies were really helpful in this organization. My special thank actually goes to the true organizers, because it's true that the event is organized by the two associations, but events are never organized by associations. They are organized by human beings. and the people who work. And the people who work in these occasions were Jacopo, Costanza, Caterina, Eduardo, Elisa, Alessandro, and I hope I'm not forgetting others, but plenty of others as well. I can't name all of them. So thank you very much. I was really impressed by all the great activity and the outcome. And I really look forward to what's going to happen in the morning and in the afternoon. Jacopo yesterday at dinner told me, oh, you don't have just to say good morning and thank people, you should also say something more. So I decided to tell you a little story, a little tale. And this is, you know, as all tales, it starts, oh, by the way, I should also thank, you know, great people who came from everywhere in the world. Now I see Marco Cappato there. For a while I was a bit worried that he wouldn't make it here for some specific reasons that we all know, and you know, all the policymakers and speakers and so on. But you know, my little story. So my little story starts with once upon a time, as usual, in a fantasy kingdom, there was a big reform, you know, going on. And so people asked the chancellor of this kingdom, of this fantasy kingdom, they said, Chancellor, you're going to make huge changes. You're going to cut some bridges. You're going to close some tunnels. You are going to change the rules according to which we move out of the kingdom and other people come in. Are you sure that this is a good idea? Can you provide us with some evidence that this is a good idea? And the chancellor said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to provide you with any evidence because it is self-evident that this is beneficial. So in this same fantasy kingdom, this happened thousands of years ago, people were really fighting one against the other, you know, because they had very strong feelings. And so some people were in favor, some people were against. But on the basis of what? Of very little, because no one had really informed them about what this reform was. And of course, no one had even thought of asking the experts, what do you think about that? And so people were discussing and debating, but not on the basis of facts, just on the basis of feelings, of sentiments. So if you want to know what happened next, I'll tell you next time, okay? So, but this is what this conference is about. This is about science, policy, and public. And so it is about a society in which policymakers don't make decisions just for a political career or on the basis of vague ideas and fantasies and who knows what, but on the basis of scientific evidence. A society in which the scientists don't stay just in their tower, but engage with the public, know how to speak to the public, to the policymakers, understand how policymaking works, which is very far from the way we would like it, but that's the way it is. So a society in which we can make decisions in a rational way on the basis of what science says, and not because science has a particular status. It's that science is what human beings at this moment know, which is not necessarily the truth, but it's at the best of our knowledge, and I think this knowledge should be used in societies. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Luisa Tondelli, and I'm the scientific attaché at the Italian Embassy in London. And I would like to say a few words today in the opening of this important conference. The Ambassador of Italy in the United Kingdom, Raffaele Trombetta, is willing to send you his warmest regard concerning this big event, because today he cannot be with us. And he wants to reaffirm the important support of the embassy to this conference, wishing you all big success in the realization. As the scientific attaché here at the embassy, I arrived last February this year, I have the main duty to reinforce the scientific collaboration between Italy and UK. And of course, we have already big evidence of the important and strong collaboration between the two countries. For example, if we take into account the huge amount of projects that have been funded so far by Horizon 2020. So we have seen that the projects funding where at least one Italian participant and one UK participant are in the consortium are now 2,460. This is also this is an important number, we believe, and this is also possible because, as Antonio was mentioning before, we have really a very strong and a strong community of Italian working here in the institution. They are estimated to be something like about 7,500 people working in the universities. We are estimating that at least 5,000 are working directly in research department, I mentioned, not only in hard science, not only in physical science and engineering, also in social science and humanities, and in different disciplines, because we believe, as the European Commission also is saying since many years, that science is really multidisciplinary and needs the effort of many different experts in many different areas. Among this community, we have a lot of people, a lot of Italian professors and researchers that have already subscribed on a voluntary basis to our database at the embassy. What is this? This is something that that allows us to stay in touch with you all. And so please, if you don't have subscribed so far, please do it. You just have to go to the website of the embassy and find the link where you can subscribe to the database of the embassy. So it's sort of a mailing list through which we can inform you about the events that we are organizing or we are organizing together with other associations. For example, you know that we have a very strong collaboration with the Association of Italian Scientists in UK, and at the same website you will also find a link to subscribe yourself to this association as well. So just to conclude, I want to say that as in the framework of the activities that the scientific office at the embassy is planning to do, we are inaugurating next Wednesday in London at the Italian Cultural Institute a new cycle of scientific seminar which has been named Science for Society. What's this? These will be meetings or debates where we would like to invite at least one representative of an Italian institution, either university or research center, and another one from a UK institution. And we would like to allow them to present the last, for example, result of the research in this field, together with, let's say, a sharing of their point of view on how much these recent research are impacting on our society. Because we really believe that science is not in a tower, as Antonio was saying. Science is in society, science is with society, and science is for society. And that's why we named this conference Science for Society. So I do invite you all, and thank you very much to the organizer for this opportunity today, and I really wish you a lot of success. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Wendy Wyver. I'm the first political counsellor at the British Embassy in Rome, and it is a real thrill to be with you today. Thank you very much for the invitation. My far better qualified Science and Innovation Network colleagues couldn't make it, so I was lucky enough to be picked to come. I'm very interested to be here today, partly because I am one of the lead organisers of the annual Pontignano Conference, which is the main bilateral conference between the UK and Italy, held on the outskirts of Siena every year. And we try to bring together the most interesting thought leaders from across all sectors of society, from politics, from government, from academia, from media, from culture, etc. And this year, one of our big themes was science and society, and we had Government Chief Scientist Sir Patrick Vallance with the amazing Professor Rino Rappuoli of GSK Vaccines, who I think we all hope will be a Nobel Prize winner one of these days for his amazing work on vaccines. And they talked on this theme of science and society, of how we need to mainstream the scientific method, the way scientists think, into the way we take our policy decisions, so that, frankly, we take better decisions and that we bring our people with us. I'm not going to say anything more on that now, because there'll be people much better qualified than I who will be talking about it in the course of today. But it's lovely to... I'm thrilled to hear about the workshops that the Italian Embassy in London will be having, and it's lovely to feel that we're all part of an initiative to mainstream scientific thinking through our societies and make science something that is not scary, as we've seen with the anti-vax movements, but something that informs the way we understand the world. And for our part, we're hoping to follow up Pontignano by perhaps bringing together some of the best thinking on counter-disinformation from the political field with some of the work on trying to combat fake news in the scientific field, to try to work out how we can more effectively stop some of the scare stories on scientific discoveries running like wildfire through our populations. But I'm also pleased to be here today to see you all as Italians. You know, the Italian community in the UK enriches our lives and our know-how beyond all measure, all 700,000 plus of you. Over the last 2 years, as the UK prepares to leave the EU, we've got even more interested in finding out where you are, what you're doing, and how well integrated you are into the lives of the United Kingdom. And we've met so many of you who've made the UK their home in all sectors. We have a great podcast series. We're knowing and sharing through our social media some incredible stories of the success that Italians are having in the UK. And if you would like to be featured, please come and find me at the coffee break, because we are always in the market for success stories of Italians contributing to the UK society. We are so proud of what we can do together and what you offer our country. And please contact us at any time if you think we can help to promote dialogue and cooperation for the future. So, complimenti for the initiative to bring everybody together today for this important meeting. I'll be scribbling frantically with all your insights and ideas for what we can do together next. And I will report back on your conference to the British Embassy in Rome and to my boss, Ambassador Jill Morris, who would also have loved to be here today, but sends you her congratulations and her very best wishes for our future cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy, and thanks to everyone. I'm Alessandro Allegra. I'm the Secretary of the Association of Italian Scientists in the UK and Program Chair for this conference. And I have the pleasure to introduce now our first keynote speaker, Professor Carl Mundell. Carl is Professor of Extragalactic Astronomy and Head of Astrophysics at the University of Bath. But she's not only a stellar scientist, as we can say, but she's also the Chief Scientific Advisor of the UK Foreign Commonwealth Office, a role that she covered since 2008, bringing scientific perspective to the work of the UK government, especially in foreign policy and diplomacy. And in this role, we have the pleasure of welcoming her to our conference. Please, Carol, thanks for coming. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to speak to you. I'm afraid I'm a little bit vertically challenged, so I'll just be peeking over the podium here, but hopefully you can all hear me. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here as a scientist. I have many long, deep friendships and collaborations with Italian colleagues. I've had actually many Italian students and postdocs working in my group who've then gone on to have wonderful careers both in academia and in industry. And so for me, it's a personal pleasure to be here. I think more importantly, as we talk about our UK-Italy bilateral friendship, that, as I say, is long and deep, the really important thing to think about in times of political turmoil is that the science relationship is the thing that is stable, and that we can maintain our friendships between our countries by keeping those people-to-people links. So whatever our personal feelings are, when we start to talk about our science and research, that's when academics forget the rest of the world. And as Antonio said, we don't see the barriers. We don't work in a nationalistic way. We work with like-minded people to advance the answers to the questions that we're trying to solve. And I think starting on the biggest scale, we have many global challenges that we cannot solve within our own countries. If we look at problems like antimicrobial resistance, however well one country tries to tackle it, that problem is cross-border. It covers all of society, it covers all sorts of different areas, whether you're designing new vaccines, whether you're talking about public behaviours, whether you're talking about systematic ways health services use or don't use antibiotics, right all the way down to how soil science works and how you will feed a global population. Those sorts of problems are too big to deal with on a nationalistic basis, and they also have to be determined and solved on a long-term scale. And then as we come down to regions, the trust is the main issue that actually you need to keep at the heart of the conversation. And my role within the Foreign Office has been a real learning curve for me for the last year. There are three main things I do. I do science in diplomacy, which is making sure that the best possible scientific evidence and advice sits at the heart of policy making, so that policy is informed by evidence. And within the Foreign Office, that's at the international level. So whether one is sitting in a diplomatic forum with maybe 50 or 100 other countries, it's the strongest scientific evidence that can often break the diplomatic impasse. And we heard the example of cutting bridges and blocking tunnels. When feelings are in the room, that's often where you get impasse, where different countries come with their different agendas, when the best scientific evidence, and that evidence is internationally peer-reviewed science, not just this country has written a paper, and that's what's very important. Within the UK, we're very fortunate to have an incredibly international research landscape. The government has been very clear about its ambition for increasing our science power internationally, ensuring that the UK continues to be the best country in the world for international global science talent to come to work, and also to make sure that that international research does have global impact for common good. And there have been very nice examples where putting that international scientific evidence on the table has changed the diplomatic conversation. The second part of my role is science for diplomacy. And as I say, because scientists don't see national borders, it's often the people-to-people relationships, and in particular the scientific relationships that grow between our early-stage career researchers, where we can open up conversations with countries that we have a very acrimonious or absolutely no diplomatic relationship with. And we've seen that in the UK with countries. One example is Argentina, where historically we were very good friends. Then we went through a period where we were very much not good friends. And actually when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he was the first UK politician to visit Argentina in 25 years after the Falklands conflict. And that was really built on work that my predecessor in this role, Professor Robin Grimes, really drove, particularly with the biomedical sector, GSK, and relationships between early-stage career researchers working on joint projects between Argentinian universities and UK universities and coming on people-to-people exchanges. And now the benefit to both countries is great, and we have a very warm friendship. And then we're tackling global problems like antimicrobial resistance and climate change and the melting of the polar ice caps, for example. And so that's the second part of my work. The third part is diplomacy for scientists. And while we think about experts and putting evidence at the heart of the equation, the other thing that one realizes when one sits in government is that sometimes our academic colleagues need help to navigate that international landscape. You've heard, obviously, of the Science and Innovation Network. That's 100 science and innovation attaches that are embedded in our embassies around the world. We cover over 50 countries or country regions. And so our science and innovation attaches, they sit in country, they understand the scientific challenges and interests and the political landscape within their region. And that intelligence is absolutely vital for growing the people-to-people links. And so they give our universities a huge amount of support if we want to grow new bilateral collaborations, if we're looking for partners on a particular project, or if we're growing joint funding mechanisms. And all of that scales up very, very quickly because our scientific and research and innovation community, including our businesses, are very keen to make those connections. And that my experience has been that's true in every country. So going on to the science advice mechanism, I've been absolutely stunned by how impressive the UK science advice mechanism is. And it didn't come there overnight, it's been quite a journey. And when one thinks of how academics can provide advice into government, some of the interesting conversations we had over dinner last night was how very different the different communities are. Politicians have very different timescales, they have very different challenges to a scientist in a lab. And sometimes when you put those two groups together, they don't know how to communicate. They have different agendas, and they look at one another sometimes as a threat. So I think the alternative talk title I probably could have given was, "So what's in it for me?" A politician might think, I'll listen to my constituents, I know what my people want, they're going to vote for me, I'll make a policy decision based on that. At the other extreme, a scientist might say, I want to do this in my lab, come hell or high water, this is what I want to do. And as I say, sometimes those two groups find that very difficult to bring together. Within the UK, we have a network of Chief Scientific Advisors. As Wendy said, Sir Patrick Vallance is the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. Sir Patrick advises Number 10 and the Prime Minister. He also convenes a group called the Science Advice for Government in Emergencies. And this is, I think, a world standard. So he's able to draw very quickly on all of the Chief Scientific Advisors across all the government departments if there is an emergency. So COBRA, which is the committee that the Prime Minister chairs and in the time of an emergency, are able then to draw on the best possible scientific advice to address whatever emergency is in place and help with evidence-based response to that emergency and the emergency planning. And the CSAs, as I say, sit in each government department. We're all very different in style, and each individual department is very different. So we deliver to our government department goals. We are civil servants, and I think that's also important. We are not lobbyists. We are not scientists in lobbying our governments for the scientific agenda. We sit as civil servants, and we serve the government of the day. That's very important because we're governed by the Civil Service Code, and that helps our ministers trust the advice that we give to them because we work in that trust environment of being a civil servant. On the other side, we're also credible scientists, and the way the CSAs are appointed, the jobs are openly advertised, and then there's a very rigorous peer review process, there's an interview process that goes on. And so when you appoint eminent science leaders into those positions, they also have credibility within their academic community. And we have a role of translation between those two communities. Not just what the scientific evidence is, but how the science method works. And as Wendy mentioned, that's important not just for explaining to ministers how this result was reached and why this is the evidence, but also starting to create that scientific method thinking within government. How do you interrogate a decision? How do you make a decision? Sometimes when the evidence is not clear-cut. We all think we will go to an expert and say, tell me the answer, and the expert will say, this is the answer. And we've all seen well, certainly in the UK, maybe not so much in Italy, you know, on Tuesday, scientists say drinking red wine's bad for your health. On Wednesday, scientists say drinking some red wine could be very good for your health. On Wednesday, scientists say maybe for some parts of the population, drinking some red wine is good, but not all the time. And the public say, well, do we drink red wine or do we not? And I think actually having a conversation about how far this scientific evidence can go on this particular decision is actually very important. The other thing that the Chief Scientific Advisors are able to do is draw on all of their learned communities. And the thing to note, obviously, is none of us are experts in absolutely every science subject. So the way I describe my week, I spend 3 days a week in the Foreign Office doing all of science across all of the world, and the other 2 days a week I go back to academia and do the rest of the universe. So that's quite a big job. So of course I'm not an expert on biomedical advances, I'm not an expert on gene editing, I'm not an expert on nuclear fusion. However, I am a scientist. I can read a scientific paper which may be full of jargon. I can understand the robustness of the method or not that that paper is describing. I understand the research ecosystem. I understand where reputable journals get their reputation from. And again, that's something that those journals must maintain. I understand the pressures and the market pressures in the publishing industry. I understand the pressures within university. I've been the head of my physics department before stepping into the Foreign Office. So I understand the challenges running a department, the different competing pressures in universities for finances. All of those pieces fit together. And as we said, people do science, and people are not perfect either. So all of that comes together and creates a trust system. And what I've seen in countries that do not have a science advice mechanism are either very polarized debates or very unstabilized debates. So scientists who get very frustrated and upset because they can see the evidence, they know what the right decision is. Policymakers who say, well, scientists are arrogant, why do you think you know the answer? Why should it be that when actually I think it might be something else? And again, the communication then breaks down. The other incredibly important part, as we've heard today about science and society, is how the general public views science, scientists, and then ultimately through to their governments. And the other thing that the UK has worked on for very many years is the engagement of scientists with the public. And when I was a young research fellow, a small fraction of my research fellowship was dedicated to public engagement. So I was encouraged to use that money to go out and do outreach events, whether that was working with schools or giving public lectures. And it also encouraged my organisation to make sure that I had the time within my working day that I could think about how I use my science to communicate and connect with the public. Developing that system over the last 10 to 20 years has been hugely important. So we have universities that have professional public engagement teams that help their academics to embed engagement with all of the scientific process, right from the beginning of the inception of the experiment that they might want to run, through to how they will engage the public in the results. That can be great when it's something of interest like black holes, but it can be incredibly important when you're talking about vaccines or you're talking about some controversial scientific area. Making sure that society is involved in that broader debate is actually how the science becomes integrated into society. And ultimately, when your society is able to engage on those debates, that is also what helps politicians to make better evidence-based policy, because ultimately they will be susceptible to public opinion. And the politicians are not experts like all of us, they're not experts in every science area. And so demonstrating to them that the robustness of the evidence that you provide has already been part of the societal conversation as the way that you create that stability and good policy making for the future. The other thing that I think we do very well in the UK, and I think that Italy's also very good at this, is the public mechanism of museums. And so obviously one thinks of museums as history and art and culture, but science museums and discovery museums are also a very integral part of that. So we have institutions like the Royal Institution, which is very much embedded in the historical development of science through our nation. The Royal Society, which is obviously our National Academy of Science. It also has a very strong public outreach. It has a summer science exhibition where it brings leading research teams to the Royal Society, and then groups of school children and the public come in to meet that science right at the interface. Our Science Museum in London, very eminent worldwide for the public engagement work that it does. It's now designed an amazing mechanism where it has little pop-up blueprints for public engagement campaigns. So for museums, it's actually very expensive to take an exhibit, pack it up, put it in a container and ship it across the world to another country. And what the Science Museum has pioneered is actually designing a blueprint so that it can send those to other countries. We've done this in Argentina, in Australia, and India. And the museum systems in those countries can then reconstitute that science engagement exercise. And that's the way that we're delivering the best possible scientific advice and evidence into other countries and into their museum networks that is scalable and is sensitive to the local country. A very good example was the superbug exhibit that the Science Museum ran last year, and that was reconstituted down in Buenos Aires. Dame Sally Davis, who's our chief medical advisor, she went down to Buenos Aires and she ran an emergency exercise. So there was a pretend exercise that there had been a microbial outbreak, a resistant microbial outbreak, and people actually worked in real time to actually try to solve that problem as if it was a real crisis. It caught the public imagination because the superbug exhibit had been on in the museum there, and so there was a whole societal conversation about, you know, how to solve this problem. There was no debate on whether science is good. There was no debate on whether politicians like scientists or not. Everybody was working together to solve this major societal crisis and take the learning away from that. And I think the other thing that's important about having a science advice mechanism is that it maintains the independence of your academic community. And again, you know, no politician likes to be lobbied and no scientist likes to be ignored. But what we've seen through the last few years as we've been working towards exiting the European Union is that our academic community has been very outspoken, and rightfully so. They are independent citizens, they're an independent sector. But what's been very valuable is that they've used their independence to quantify what they believe is the impact of any of the Brexit planning as the time was moving on. And when they were able to present evidence, for example, the value of the Horizon 2020 programme, we were able as CSAs to take that evidence to our ministers in a quantifiable way. And what that meant was that the ministers Minister Skidmore in the Department for Business, Energy and the Industrial Strategy was able to provide an underwrite for the funding, which means that our European funding programmes are completely stable. We maintain our reputation as honest, long-term, stable partners, and it means that the money is there for the scientists to continue to work with their partners with Italy and across the whole of Europe. So that conversation was enabled because the scientists had an independent voice. They could speak to the media, they could voice their opinions, but when they provided the evidence to government, we were able to take that straight to our ministers, and I think that's been very positive. And so we are then able to say that we are a world-leading science nation. We believe in those science collaborations, and we really have the money on the table to make sure that those relationships continue. And I think that that's incredibly important when there is, you know, time of political debate, which of course is what tends to play on the televisions or in the newspapers, and it's right that politicians have a space to do their political debating, and that the whole mechanism sits together and works well. So I think in terms of Italy and your science advice mechanism, it's a win-win for everybody. For policymakers, their decisions will be robust, they will also be respected, and they will have credibility not just within their own country, but also internationally, which is something that's very important with it when Italy then stands on the international stage. In terms of funding, if you have a robust science advice mechanism, if you can show the impact of the science that you have for growing the economy, again, that's good for your country, it's good for your leaders, it's good for the whole ecosystem. And showing the value of science through that innovation pipeline is ultimately what drives your prosperity and then provides the funding again to benefit society and grow the next wave of scientific innovation. And then I think the final thing I would say is about young people. I know there are a number of European countries that are struggling with the brain drain. We're very fortunate to have a very energetic international community of young scientists working in the UK. And we also value when those young researchers go out into the world because they always stay friends with the UK. And so that's actually what creates that strong global science network around the world. Those young people will go on to become leaders, they may become politicians, they will become influencers in their country and internationally. And if they have come from a robust science evidence-based environment, whatever work they go on to do, whether that's in companies, whether that's in policy making, they will take that method of thinking into everything that they do. And that then provides, in my opinion, more stability globally, so that we can actually get to a position where we can connect country to country when it comes to big policy decisions. So I hope that you have a very exciting conference. I'm going to finish a few minutes early. If anybody would like to ask questions, I'm very happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carol. So yeah, we have a few minutes. Yeah, we have a question. Yes, maybe can you please introduce yourself and ask your questions?
Mm-hmm.
And my question is relating with the science. There's no meaning to talk about science if not thinking in terms of data. This means now we are in a fourth revolution. And therefore, science, in a way you describe, is still traditional. We would like to have a more, let's say, data-driven, let's say, strategy for science. We are involved with the European Union on Horizon 2020. So we see what is missing. Data are not there. So this means new technology like data, big data, artificial intelligence are in silos. So you do research in silos. Don't put in one.
Okay.
In one common vision. And therefore, is that what the Commission now is trying to do?
Sure.
To develop this data digital hub in Europe.
Sure. So let me answer that question. I think data are huge. Yeah. I think data is hugely important, and I think, again, putting it back into the science advice mechanism, the way our funding structure has developed in the UK, we have our bottom-up proposals, scientists who have good ideas who apply for funding. But we also have our top-down, so the industrial strategy and the grand challenges, artificial intelligence and data science is one of the government's key priorities. And they have put a huge amount of money, so the UK is actually one of the leaders in the research space in AI. And that feeds through to our small and medium enterprises. So we have, one of the grand challenges is AI and robotics, and we have sector deals that then integrate that all across because of the recognition that data-driven science creates both prosperity and also some challenges. And again, going back to how you have those conversations within society, science in the broadest sense. So yes, you know, on one hand, computer scientists are doing amazing things. And, you know, I've always been a data scientist, to be honest. I've always worked in big data because I'm an astrophysicist. But we have a revolution, for example, AI and data science through health. So there's a huge amount of leadership within the UK in that. But on the other side, we also have ethical questions that we have to address around privacy, super AI, the integrity of the algorithms that are being developed. So, for example, embedding gender bias and racial bias within the computational algorithms at speed will absolutely revolutionize and change the way society works if we don't have good governance and ethics mechanisms around the data science. Equally, what that does to the world of work. So we think of human labor, we think of people going to work. If AI systems change the way we need to change society and how we do that work, all of those conversations sit both within policy, they sit within research. Often social scientists have to start to work now in an interdisciplinary environment with physical scientists and engineers and the computer scientists that are designing these algorithms. So we need that interdisciplinary research landscape. And I think the UK has recognized that. We have the Turing Institute for Data Science, we have the AI Ethics Unit. It's been very much recognized because the scientific community have communicated through to policymakers, and it's now being reflected in the top-down funding priorities of the government. So again, a very positive ecosystem. So I think that's a really important point. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Any more questions from the audience? Then I will take my privilege to ask a question then.
Sure.
As we discussed already, as you know, I have an interest in the structures and ecosystems of scientific advice. And we'll talk about this later, but we've been trying to think how this could be articulated in Italy. And as you recognize, it took a long time for the UK to get to the point where it is now. So I would like to ask, what will be the to one thing that you think should be different in the UK system, that currently, you know, it could be improved in the UK trans-advice ecosystem?
I think talking in the past, the thing that possibly has worked incredibly well recently is the transparency of appointments. The system has gradually grown from, you know an eminent scientist, and as a politician or a leader, you pick up the phone and you phone your friend because you trust them. Sir John Beddington, when he was government chief scientific advisor, the Fukushima disaster happened in Japan, and he pulled together a group of leading scientists. And the question they were trying to answer was whether we should remove our embassy staff from Tokyo after the nuclear disaster. And there were some embassies who were immediately evacuating their people. And obviously the Japanese citizens weren't being evacuated because that was where they lived. And so Sir John ran this very deep and extensive scientific study using fluid dynamicists and physicists and trying to understand soil chemistry to quantify accurately what the risk to human health was. And that study concluded that the risk was very, very low, and we did not evacuate our people from the embassy. So that played two roles. First of all, obviously it created a huge amount of respect for us within Japan. The advice was then also disseminated to the local people, which also helped them to understand the level of risk. And it showed the strength of having that convening power. So I think now that we have CSAs in every department, we have a very strong network. We meet on a weekly basis to address maybe common problems or to have an invited speaker to upskill us. The other thing that I should mention that I know you've worked on, Alessandro, is the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. And that's about 31 years old now. And that's actually an amazing office where they'll take a particular issue. Is red wine good for you? I'm being facetious, but let's take that question. And they will then draw all of the scientific expertise. They'll have a huge list of scientists and advisors who will advise into that question. They will do very, very deep peer review. And then they'll write a very short note. We call them post notes, 2, 3, 4 pages at most. That sits within Westminster for busy parliamentarians to pick up. It's also online. You can go and Google. It's all in the public. Very simple question that might be informing a policy debate in Parliament on that week. The politicians can go and pick that paper up and read it very quickly. They've got so much to deal with and say, this is the current state of play. So that's a very important mechanism that's independent and sort of coordinated with the CSAs. And I think the other thing that we do very well is we have our select committees. So much of the work that you will see if you watch TV will be the debating chamber, but that's actually a very tiny fraction of government. Lots of the work is done in select committees where cross-party politicians sit together, be it the Science and Technology Select Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they will take evidence and they will then actually do investigations and write reports. And so drawing science and technology evidence into those select committee inquiries is also a very important part of that stability for the mechanism. And I think just, what we might do in the future, I think that's a really good question. I don't know, I'm going to think about it.
Thank you very much, Carol, for your input and these ideas that we'll probably take with us for the rest of today, and hopefully we can discuss this further later. Thank you. Just one announcement before we move on to our first panel. Unfortunately, one of our speakers had a health problem on the last minute, so Ricardo Luna cannot be with us today for the AI panel later, but the conference will go on, and I'm sure we're going to have a very stimulating discussion nevertheless. So he sends his apologies. Unfortunately, this was unexpected, but these things happen. So thank you for your understanding, and we move on to our first panel.
Okay, so here we are at the first panel of this conference, and this session, this specific panel, will deal with the sub-theme environment and infrastructure. So we have to look at the relationship between science policy and the public in the specific context of environment and infrastructure. This is actually a very important theme, a very hot theme. The UK has been investing quite a big effort in infrastructure research recently created UCRIC, the UK Collaboratorium for Research on Infrastructure and cities. And Cambridge is hosting a national research facility on infrastructure sensing, of which I am the academic lead, so it is quite appropriate that I should be here. But I don't want to take much time dealing with the topic in general, because it's always, we are tight for time, and I would like to leave as much space as possible to our speakers. So the speakers, we have Giorgia Giardina, who is here as the scientist, so he's representing research. And Giorgia is currently a lecturer at the Department of Architecture and Civil Engineering at the University of Bath. I know Giorgia very well because she's been a research associate at Cambridge for a number of years, so we were also working together vaguely on the topic of the interaction between tunneling and the built environment. And she's an expert on structural damage. Her background is structures, not geotechnics. So she did a PhD at Delft University looking at damage in masonry structures. And also now she's moving more and more towards the topic of infrastructure assessment and sensing, and more particularly to the topic of remote sensing. So I believe that she's going to be talking about recent developments in INSAR monitoring of the impact of huge tunneling projects on the built environment. On the other end, we have Andrea Taramelli, and Andrea has a lot of academic titles. So, you know, when you look at his CV, he's currently a professor at USS in Pavia, and for those of you who don't know, in Italy there are a number of scuole superiori. So there is the Normale in Pisa, which I believe is the oldest, then the Sant'Anna again in Pisa, the SISSA in Trieste, and the USS in Pavia. And these scuole superiori are really centers for excellence in research. They typically have only graduate students. Normale in Pisa also has undergraduate students. But he's also, so he's a professor at USP Pavia. He's also a reader in remote sensing and surface coastal process science at the Institute of Environmental Protection and Research in Roma. He is lecturing at U Center, so you would say this is a well-rounded academic. He's done a PhD in slopes, he's worked in the United States. However, he's here as a policymaker. So the role that he's going to take in this particular debate this morning is that of policymaker. So there is going to be a tension with Giorgia. And his credentials for taking on this role is because he's a member of the Copernicus User Forum of the European Commission. That is essentially something which should help the European Commission in the implementation of existing union legislation, programs and policies. And also is on the coordination committee on space for the Presidenza del Consiglio dei Ministri, so for the Italian presidency of the Councils of Ministers. I'm not really sure how you translate this. So here is going to be the policymaker. And then I won't say anything anymore and we'll leave the floor to Giorgia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia, for the kind introduction. I really want to mention that it was a wonderful, inspiring speech, the first one, and I don't know, I want to do more now, the job that I love already, so thank you very much. So first, well, I do not have an intention to create tension, by the way, as a researcher. No, but I'm here because, as Julia said, so I'm specifically focused on the use of satellite monitoring at the moment for the monitoring of underground constructions. Indeed, it's the policymaker part is probably more of a learning process for me because I'm not that experienced in that. But I would like to share some thought that I have about communicating research to different type of audience. And I'm going through examples like communicating research to different type of researchers who study something different. That is sometimes as different as communicative research to people that are not necessarily used to the same type of reasoning, and communicating to industry, communicating to stakeholders, and communicating to the public. And I'm going to do it going through a little bit of a technical stuff, meaning that I will give you a little bit of an insight of what I do on my daily based research. I am interested in tunneling and underground construction as a response to urbanization challenges. So we know very well that we are dealing with increased urbanization and everything that that is bringing, including clearly the lack of space as in the first instance, but also traffic congestion and pollution. And underground construction, so exploiting the use of space underground, so somewhere else, is actually helping somehow to make cities more sustainable. First of all, we can free some space on the surface, and that sometimes can be ideally used to get some extra green space, maybe. But also we have then the possibility to reduce the congestion and reduce the traffic and reduce the pollution from the surface. On top of that, centralizing transportation and having the possibility to exploit tunneling, for example, for transport, is also a way to rationalize the energy efficiency and to reduce the sprawl of cities. So there are a million of benefits that I see, at least myself, I'm slightly biased, on the use of underground space. And my personal contribution as a researcher, because also partially because I'm a structural engineer, it's to look at how to make this excavation easier, so more sustainable from the point of view of their impact and their potential risks. So imagine that we are, and you don't really need to imagine, but imagine you are excavating a tunnel underneath a European city, let's say London. And you have to take into account the fact that you are not only excavating, you are creating a certain disturbance in the surrounding, and this type of disturbance can affect the buildings on the surface. Imagine that instead of being in a situation of having new buildings on the surface and structure that has been designed according to the very recent code, you have instead historical structure that can be particularly fragile, maybe due to their material they have been built, or because they have a specific historical and cultural heritage that need to be protected. So our role as structural engineers who look at this potential impact of underground excavation is to make sure that everything goes smoothly and that tunneling can actually be built without much of complaints, because we make sure that we can predict whatever is going to happen on the surface, and we take measurements against any possible risk if necessary. So I'm specifically focused on what we call differential settlements, so subsidence of the ground that can affect with different type of displacement, different parts of a same structure. And this type of displacement can cause tension inside a structure that create damage. So the basic motivation is for me to try to reduce that impacts and to make the construction of tunnels safer in that respect. And you can already picture the fact that a lot of monitoring might be involved in that respect. So from the scientific point of view, one very interesting question is how the structure itself interact with the excavation. So on one hand, we have the possibility to measure a sort of a, we call it green field, because it's the deformation of the tunnel that happens if we do not take into account the effect of any building on the surface. That's what will happen on a countryside. But something very different is the actual deformation that is happening at the structural level because of the fact that the structure is there, because it has a certain mass, a certain stiffness, a certain weight, and so it does affect the displacement of the soil. So the analysis of the soil structure interaction effect is per se really relevant because it's telling us something more detailed about the actual potential damage that is happening to the structure. And I've been working in the last, I started 10 years ago, sort of working on industry projects that they are related to these topics with the construction of the North-South Metro line in Amsterdam that has pretty much the same type of trouble that Crossrail had in London, followed by a project for the construction of a tunnel in the tiny little city of Delft, still in the Netherlands, and Crossrail here in the UK. So one example, one classic example of a structure we might be concerned is the one that you see here in the picture. This is the plan of the structure, and we have, these are the twin tunnels of Crossrail. There are two different tunnels. And so you see that the structure is close enough to the tunnels to suspect that there might be some issue at the moment of the excavation. So what we do in order to figure out which are the factors, which are the parameters that are actually involved in the problem, and trying to use that knowledge to predict in any other circumstances what could happen, is to look at the actual monitor deformation for specific case studies. Now what you see here is the deformation. These dots represent the monitoring point that we have at the ground level. And generally, for projects of this size, we have plenty. Traditionally, we have plenty of measurements that they are taken at the ground level. The star point are instead the point that we measure at the building level. So these are the actual deformation of the structure. And those, they are really not that common or not that frequent. There are practical reasons, there are financial reasons. But the fact is that we end up with way less information about the structure itself than we have about the ground. So I was working with this in this context and trying still to figure out the best that I could based on this information. And I had a very interesting meeting, and that happens a few years ago, with a brilliant scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory that I met during a conference, and told me, I have the tool for you. Like, I understand perfectly what you need, and worry no more, I have the tools that can solve all your problems. He meant satellite monitoring. So he meant, he was definitely working as a specialist in the field, and he said, we have the possibility to take advantage and exploit the relative rotation between satellites going around Earth. And basically, because the satellite is sending constantly a radar signal, and the radar signal is bouncing back from object that is encountering on the surface, every time that the satellite finds itself in the exact same position with respect to, let's say, the structure, in this case that we are analyzing, it's able to detect any possible change in the position of this structure. The fantastic bit is that, and that was sold to me like that, is that we are talking about the sensitivity of millimeters. So we are talking about the possibility to see from the sky if the corner of this room is settling of 5 millimeters, which was honestly a little bit too much to believe and too good to believe. So this brings me a little bit to the first point that I would like to make. So what we agree, because I was very skeptical at that point, what we agree was to try to evaluate a specific case studies where I know something or actually a lot about. And we agree on having a look at the Crossrail test case studies where I could confirm that it was possible to detect 10 to 20 millimeters displacement. This is the track of a part of a section of the Crossrail. And it was actually possible from the plan of all the surveys point that the satellite made to detect this red line, which is precisely matching the line of the rail track. So I was convinced, and I also learned something that I tend to apply myself in communication with industry and in stakeholder, and that's my first thought, that is, we have the need to not only to explain as clear as we can what we are doing, but also to try to create specific example or specific case studies that relate to the need of the person we are talking to the need or to the background, to the need or to the knowledge. It was much easier for me in this situation believing that the tool was actually a tool that was made for me and not just in abstract term reading papers from a different discipline and imagine the general public reading research and just base my trust on that. So we definitely agreed on the fact that it was possible to monitor in a quasi-real-time situation the progress of the tunnel, and we moved then to focus on the specific level of information that we can get at the building level, so more in detail. Now you remember how frustrated and sad I was about the 3 poor stars that I had on a single building before. This is the equivalent type of information that we could get by using satellite monitoring, the orange point that you see in this picture. So plenty of data that actually allow me to make a decent profile and a reliable profile of the deformation that structure is going through. And this is, so this type of information didn't really, it didn't come out like that from the processing. It does require an expert that evaluates the possible error, the noise of this data. So the second point that I learned there is that when we communicate and when we pitch in a way how good is the research that we are performing, we sometimes tend to underestimate how important is to communicate the effort as well. So how difficult it is to get to that point. And is it something, if we talk about, we are developing a tool for decision makers, we love saying that, but is that a tool that is really directly applicable and everyone can use, or if it does, how heavily it requires the intervention of someone that is expert enough, not necessarily to have developed the tool, but very close in the field of the expertise. So it was wonderful for us. It was fitting our purpose. Yes, it was. We discussed a lot about errors and noise, and we actually were eventually able, for a specific set of structures, to quantify that distance or that difference that I was mentioning before between the so-called greenfield, countryside type of displacement and the displacement that you effectively have when the building is playing a role in the picture. So the next step, and that is the final and conclusive point, the next step was for me, for my group, to develop an approach that is more extensive and that can be used systematically on large projects, and basically acquire a set of information from the company that is dealing with the construction, and that can be information about the buildings, the plans of the building typologies, which age there are, all information that can tell us something about how we expect the structure to react to a certain type of movement. And on the other hand, the satellite data set that is telling us how each of the points that they are monitored is moving. Now, the third issue that is involved here, and I think is something really important when we talk with policymakers for sure, but with stakeholders of infrastructure, for example, with industry for sure, it's time. So in between this picture and this picture, there is more than 1 year. So I think 1.5 years. And that depends on the fact that I have a very small group when I define this work, and with very small group, it means that I was me and myself doing the job, and I have a decent group with actually of brilliant PhDs at the moment that they are supporting the research, and they are able to do magic with coding and with realizing consistent algorithms that can look at big pictures. But by nature in research, that is a very variable quantity. So that time in between ideas and development, it is a very variable quantity. And it's really by nature like that, in the sense that we are all working in an environment where we train ourselves, And possibly the best achievement that we can make for everyone is for people to learn as much as they can and then move on to the next step. So it's sometimes very difficult to fulfill the expectation of a different partner than expect some delivery in a very short term, or at least in a sure and defined time. I do not have actually answer to the third issue. Well, I had some insight to the first two. Maybe we get to know something later on. I don't know. I'm going to learn a lot, I'm sure, in the rest of the day today. But that's all on my side. And I'm open to question. I don't know if now, probably later. I guess later. Do not ask anything now. My fault. Thank you very much.
I can start if it's not going to happen. Okay. So I would like to thank for the invitation, and I was called and invited to talk about policy. Actually, the first two speech introduce what I was not thinking to talk about, but for me was an example. I was a pure scientist. I'm a geophysicist, and I was a pure scientist in Earth observation for 10 years in the United States. Then the policy asked me to help the government after 10 years to start to make scientific advisory, especially in implementing operational services at national level. And it was a good, a great challenge. So I can say I was for 10 years in the United States doing pure research. And then it's 10 years that I'm back to Italy doing still research, but advising different government, because we had different government that happened in these last 10 years. And as far as I can tell, it was really a great experience, because even if the governmental are changing, this is still something that all the new government are still keeping. So what we have done in these last 10 years is looking on what are really good research and what is really good research that we are still doing, and how can we implement something that has to be communicated and that can be used as a policy baseline to make some decision. And as the previous speaker already introduced, it's not easy to talk to politicians, and it's not easy, I'm telling, to talk to scientists. It's really not easy. Actually, we are sometimes thinking this is the reality, this is the right things to do, and the time scale, I don't think it's quite different. Also, politician has a time scale that can be, can be looked to 10 years in advance. Of course, they have to be convinced. So the scientific research has to be robust and enough clear to be communicated and to be used. So it's not a tension between me and the previous speaker. I'm always saying that before putting as a real operational tool, you have to pay attention, because you cannot oversell research. You really have to be passionate. You have to be a passionate researcher and passionate, scientist. So when they come to me in the United States saying like, can you help us in doing something operational, or like, can you advise us? I was not alone. This was a question that was done to like several scientists. So I'm telling you that for me was really a good experience. First to go abroad to have a wide discussion with like several scientists. And then it was really a great coming back, because they were asking, based on what you have done, what can be implemented for like policy context. And what we have built, especially for emergency, we have built a system that is based, so the threshold between science and policy is not there, because the National Civil Protection System and also the Environmental National Protection System is based on science. So it's really based on science. So this was exciting for me, being asked from my country, can you contribute to that? And I was sort of scared at the beginning, but then after 10 years, I can say it was really a great coming back to Italy, because I have faced with like several politicians, and I've figured out that there's a big discussion about that. So I was asked to do something, related to infrastructure in this lecture, and to what is, Earth observation. And the thing is that I would like really to introduce what we have done in the last 10 years in Italy as an example how you can use research and the role of the remote sensing in order to make a politician choice and decision. So I really go fast saying that Italy has a lot of like natural hazards. So we have seismic problem in Italy, we have tsunami problem in Italy, we have a volcanic risk. So we have also flood risk. So you can imagine how much infrastructure can be impacted. And it's not enough. We have landslides risk. And we also have forest fire. So you can understand that when you talk with like politicians, but also to who is doing operational protection, civil protection, we are dealing with a lot of issues. So if we put like and overlap critical points along linear infrastructure and landslides, forest fire, and so on, you can understand it's a huge problem. Actually, talking with a politician that is the regional president of Campania, he was saying, you are an advisory group of bad luck. So that's when you start to talk with people. So you say like, why we are talking with you? You are really bad luck people. But then they have to face with like Etna or with Vesuvio, they have to face, national civil protection issues. So you have sort of find a scientific way to deal with that. So the point was like, okay, if we do an Italian risk matrix, we have, bad luck. Earthquakes, flood, so you have number of events, years, the frequency, how many people are killed, are injured, and which are the total affected people, and then damage estimation. So it's a lot of research that we have to do to deal with that. And we have to be robust, because also communication is not easy. 2 weeks ago, there was this giant simulation in Vesuvio and Campi Flegrei about like civil protection evacuation. And you cannot go there and say, okay, you have to go out because there's an emergency. People want to be sure. And also, I was talking before, like when you show a map with subsidence from satellite and you have a lot of red dots, people become scary. Wow, I have a house on a red dots. So my house, it's less, it's less valuable. And do I have to go out now, tomorrow, in a week, in a month? It's not easy to deal with that. And you have to be clear that a red dot doesn't mean that it's collapsing. It's something that is in danger, but it's not like collapsing. So the communication and the policy matter, and politicians need to understand about that. So showing maps with red dots is dangerous sometimes. So we have to be clear what the meaning of the red dots. And also because politicians, if we take into account like red dot maps, then they use that to make some advice saying, okay, we are going to produce an operational system that is going to be monitoring all the school, all the houses in Italy. And then if you have a lot of red dots, which are the first schools that you are going to check? So it's complicated. So science has to be aware that making decision is complicated. You know, prioritization, type of damage, and so on. So the last 10 years was really complicated, at least for me. So the idea is, you know, how can we build a national civil protection activities? So we have to deal with forecasting, prevention, assistance, and emergency management and overcoming. So the law is mostly focused, you see, on warning evacuation, but then you have to do risk assessment, you have to do mitigation, and so on. So science has to deal with all these issues. So the Italian public policy to cope with risk assessment and management is quite complicated. So I don't want to go deeply in all this, but the point is that science has to deal with all of this. And it's not easy. And you have to always say in the first issue is that you have primary law that you have to deal with. You have to respect that primary law. And if you are dealing with primary law, so which are the local, regional, and central actors and authorities that are dealing with. You have to deal with prefetti, you have to deal with the regional authorities, you have to deal with national authorities, and who is going to lead? Also, that is not an issue, so scientists have to clearly understand with whom I have to talk first and then to the other. So it's really complicated. So the point was we have to deal with real-time activities, and we have to do with delay time. So preparedness, but we have to do also with the emergency. So I'm underline for the discussion later on, how can we talk about a real-time tool? What is a real-time? Pay attention when you talk about like real-time operational tool. It's not a real-time. Earth observation is not a real-time. It cannot be a real-time. It's a delay time. You can have an on-demand tool, but it's not a real-time. So that's why, as a scientist, we have to really be keen on what we are talking and what we are communicating. So we set it up what is the directive. So a primary law that identifies the activation of the functional center for the hydrological, meteorological, and hydraulical risk. So the National Civil Protection is dealing mostly with that, but then when we talk about like early warning system, so we have to build up a command and control, we have to clearly state which are the procedures, and then we can add all the other sectors. So if we are dealing with volcanic, seismic, technological, forest fires, tsunamics, and so on. So in the National Civil Protection Law, we are based on what we call functional center network, and they are all scientific research labs that are recognized by a primary law that allow University of Firenze, the Italian Space Agency, the Institution of Environmental Protection and Research, the INGV, that is the Geophysical Institution, the Italian Meteorological, and other research center to cope with emergency and to the communication. So even if you publish a good paper, but you are not a primary law functional research center, you cannot talk to politicians and so on. This is not to sort of like make a door closed, but it's, you have to validate. The director of the National Civil Protection is directly linked to the Prime Minister. So he decides in charge with the Prime Minister. So you have to talk to him based on research, but it has to be validated that. And it's a clear, procedures that cannot be then just sort of like not agreed by a scientific paper. Scientific paper, if they are signed by people of the National Functional Center, has a specific duties that has to be discussed with the Prime Minister and with the President or the Director of the National Civil Protection. So this is a clear advisory scientific way of discussing. All the other ways, it's a good science, but it's not a tool and it cannot be a policy tool. So based on that, we have like several products that are all based on scientific research of the National Functional Center. And they have to deal with ministry, regions, and prefecture. So you have to discuss daily with that. and they are activated by this primary law and this scientific center. And then I introduce the other issue, is that 10 years ago, when the GMS, the Global Earth Observation Monitoring, was born at European level, the decision was, how can we use the Earth observation at European level to implement a national operational system? So we have worked as an Italian system for the Prime Minister Cabinet to implement a regulation, a European regulation, that is named Copernicus. And it's open, free, and free of charge data and information. I underline not just data, information, because data is not enough. You need to have data and information. And it's good to have information, because if you just put data in a box, it doesn't make a good information for a policymaker. So this is the way that we tested with all the functional center, and as you can see, we were really dealing a lot also with interferometry, and we were using how we can use this type of tool and research to implement operational services. And then we had like H2020 and FP7, huge project to deal with that. So SAFER was one of that. And based on that, the Copernicus program was born. And it's a European regulation, so you have a lot of data information to do that. You don't have to replicate. And the point is that it's a program where you have like Copernicus Committee and Copernicus User Forum, where in the committee you make the decision, and the user forum you deal with the users, what they need. Before making a tool, what is the user requirements? What is the user need? What we need to do our policy implementation. And then we replicate, and I'm happy to say that Italy was at the front in that, because we implemented the National User Forum in a very complex environment, and this is a good way of explaining what is Copernicus. It's an upstream, it's a midstream, so core services, you have a downstream, you have business and research, and then you have all the uptake, the end users. And it's, you have a research project and you have application project. Based on that, we can say that the Earth observation need has to make clear which are the solutions in respect of European Framework Directive and the national implementation. So which are the needs and the requirements that has to be solved by really good science. So we made this very easy scheme that needs for the requirements. You have remote sensing data, in situ data, models, and then you do knowledge capacity, and then you give the services. So I'm going really fast to say that the legal framework that was implemented in Italy with the law number 7 in 2018 put up the Presidenza del Consiglio, a interministerial committee where all these discussions are done. So the advisory scientific group, it's involved directly with the policy. Who is doing the decision? So I'm really going fast. This was all the way of how this was going, was discussing, just to show you that one of the operational services that is going to be funded and implemented in Italy and discussed in the cabinet is the ground motion services. And we call the ground motion and non the ground infrastructure monitoring services, because from my background, I can state with confidence that you are not monitoring infrastructure, you are monitoring ground motion movement. Then you're monitoring how the infrastructure is dealing with the ground motion, but you never get a monitoring of the infrastructure. You get the monitoring, the movement of the ground in respect of the line of sight of the satellite. Pay attention to what you said in the paper and the research, because it's different saying that you are monitoring an infrastructure and you are monitoring the ground. Thanks. I'm really happy to always conclude that the user always has the last word.
I was instructed that I have the privilege of being the first one to ask questions for a little while. So it is a difficult time because, of course, there are a lot of specific questions that one might want to ask that are also quite technical. I think George and Andrea, you should be sitting at the front so we can grill you properly. And but there are, so first of all, two small specific questions. One to Georgia, because both speakers had some elements in their talks that may or may not relate to the Italian case particularly. So Georgia was talking about putting an underground infrastructure in a European city, and she used London as an example. And I was thinking, if other than London, that would have been Rome, say. It is completely different because you're dealing with different type of physical constraints. So you definitely have a really densely built urban environment with a lot of historic and vulnerable structures. I would argue more so than in London. You have a much emptier underground space because you don't have as many tunnels interacting with underground facilities, piled foundations, inclined passageways. In some of the examples you were showing for Crossrail, it was difficult to find the route through existing underground structures, but you do have a lot of buried archaeology. So one of the main problems in putting an underground line in Rome is direct interferences with archaeology. And you have different type of constraints. So, because here we're talking about the relation between policy and, in a way, science or research, one of the experiences was that, for instance, Line C of Rome Underground was a huge opportunity for research in archaeology. Some of the findings along Line C of Rome Underground were nearly got the prize for the most important archaeological finding in here a couple of years ago. They went second, so it was then awarded to some place in France. But it was so important, and nobody would have ever dreamt of digging an archaeological excavation in the center of Rome if it was not for the station. So, although right at the beginning of the line, the tension was all, the archaeologists said, no, you're not doing this because you're damaging our archaeology. And the engineers were, in reality, it was a huge opportunity for archaeological research. I mean, there is no money in archaeological research. There is a lot of money into building underground lines. So what are but there are a lot of barriers that are cultural, but also legislation, like, what you can and you cannot do, how strong your impact on the heritages, and particularly in Italy, some of this is very backwards. How can we effectively remove those, play a positive role in removing those?
So, beautiful question and big responsibility. I feel Rome as an example of a small issue in a city with little architectural and cultural heritage. Two aspects, I think, here, if I'm getting it right from your question. The archaeological part, if we only focus at the specific tool, so my view is a little bit of a larger view. Like, I'm a structural engineer, I'm interested in see how buildings respond. So this is one of the tools that at the moment we feel innovative and we are experimenting in using. This specific one for the archaeology bit will not necessarily help much, in the sense that whatever you know that is underground, so if you are excavating and you need to deal with what just happened, what just appear underground, I think that there are different series of consideration that there are a difficult balance between how much you really need to get through anyway with the project and how much you can take advantage of the project to exploit and to learn something. So I wouldn't probably be able, at least not with my expertise, to solve the underground archaeological bit of it. However, something that I did not mention for reason of time, we have seen the use of monitoring just to see what happens with a specific delay that depends on basically on the satellite going around the orbit. But what we are specifically interested in is using that data and try to use that data to develop better prediction method for a different case. Meaning that I'm not only interested in seeing what just happened, because it's cool, but it happens already. So if there was damage already, that's something that I cannot help. But the amount of information that I can obtain from field monitoring, which is traditionally a difficult source for good data, it helped me to develop better strategies that next time, for a similar project or a different project, for different movement or different settlement, can instruct me to say, oh, these specific buildings are actually endangered. The other not, because they perform much, much better. I've seen it before. I have a huge set of data. So in that respect, I think that any type of work that used the extra value and the extra tool and the extra technology that give access to data that we didn't have before can help a lot the future use. I'm sorry, I'm really not able to help.
No, I think you are in somehow in a very tangential way, because I didn't want to focus it exactly on archaeology. It was more about this is a real tension that there is when you build any civil engineering project, particularly in Italy. I'm not really sure that it is the same in the UK, but because this forum is devoted to Italy, I would like to talk to Italy. There is always this very big tension between, say, engineering and conservation. So when we started with Line C of Rome Underground, they said, what is an admissible displacement for this structure? And the answer was 0, which, of course, an admissible settlement of 0 doesn't make any sense. So I think that then, by doing the work, so monitoring and doing these things, as you said, maybe I can use it forward to say, look, even if your structure has suffered a settlement this big, it hasn't suffered that much. And in fact, it was also an opportunity to take a closer look at this structure and maybe do something about it, because a lot of these things, say Aurelian walls, in a really poor state of repair, but because you had to go under it with the underground, you took a look at it. So thank you.
Sorry, just to add, yes, we have the comparison in the UK, and is the Society of Owners of Georgian Houses, which actually have a very, it's not really a joke, they have a very deep cultural interest in it. It's not only because they own the house and they are worried about the damage, but there is a very strong awareness of the architectural heritage. And so it's something almost replacing the type of scientific defense that people busy in restoration they have in Italy.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I had a comment and a question. My question will come later, but my comment here is that this is part of a bigger global challenge, I think. So we see this very much in any kind of debate around how to work in a sustainable way. So whether you're talking about seabed mining, launching satellites into space. Currently there's a huge debate in the astronomy community because Elon Musk has launched 60 satellites of a possible 12,000 satellite constellation, maybe 40,000. Optical astronomers now see these things with their mobile phones, and there was a little interchange they had with him on Twitter, but hey, what are you doing to the sky? We can't see the sky anymore. So exactly the same as that archaeological debate. Whether marine scientists want to protect seabed life, whether mining companies or pharmaceutical companies want those minerals. So I think the science, society, and policy space is incredibly important. It is an important voice for the scientists to say, just stop. If you do this, this is the consequence. Then the policymakers say, but we need to do this for prosperity or whatever. There will then be commercial interests, which may be much bigger voices than the scientists' voices. And it's a conversation that has to happen in a very robust and open way. And the scientists then going and saying, rather than just no, because they then might get told, tough, you lose it. It's then no or this instead. Or can we work together in a way that we produce a way to work in extreme environments in a sustainable way so that people can satisfy the interests and the needs they have, because the ultimate one beyond that might be human health or the stability of a particular population. And then the unintended consequences, because often scientists can't necessarily predict. We don't yet know the consequence. So keeping on monitoring and keeping the dialogue open, rather than those communities hating one another and policymakers just having to make a random decision in the middle. So I think it's a universal discussion, but I think the archaeology one's a really nice example. Could I just ask my follow-up questions? I was interested in both of what you said about communication at every level, whether that's between one expert to another, how you don't oversell, how you say what's the meaning of the red dot. All of that visualization and representation is incredibly important. Do you think that that is now helping? Because we've seen some high-profile cases of scientists or science advisors being sacked for getting it wrong. Do you think that that's helping to move the discussion on in a more positive way?
I start and then I leave the final conclusion because probably more aware on certain specific aspect. In my opinion, yes, in the sense that we need to educate ourselves more in accepting complexity and understanding limits. Yes, we have the compulsion and we should have the aim of clarifying. Clarifying, so making things clear, in my opinion, doesn't mean it's not the same that making things simple. Because they are not, and when they are not, it's really a lie to say that they are. So I think that two things together, the clarification as opposite of just simplifying, and being honest with limitation, not feeling, it's a little bit the way now the scientific production is somehow perceived as a success, that we need to perform and say that we have been brilliant. But traditionally, and it should be like that, a whole chunk of any research production need to talk about what is not there and what the tool is not able to do. And I don't think people are necessarily afraid of that, or if the assumptions are clear, so if the complexity is clearly explained, it's easier also to say, look, I arrived until there, and honestly, I cannot really say much more than that. It requires a little bit of self-confidence, probably on the personal level, so you need to be in peace with what you have done, so that everything else is fine. What you have not done is fine, but I think it would, yes, and it will actually, because we can help doing it.
I think it's improving, but it still needs a lot of work to be done, because that was the main intention of also involving the National Civil Protection with like a center of competence, because it's still, even if you are like confident on what you are doing, explaining to the population is not easy. Absolutely not easy, and it's a problem of like really also value of things, and I often think that still scientists still have no clue about how to communicate that. It's still something that we have to work on a lot. And Amaro is making an example to my research group in Rome, saying, pay attention. They pay research not a lot, but they pay us for, let's say, having fun, but really do something helpful for this, the civil environment. And we have to force ourselves not to be, on a tower. And we are still here. Yeah, we still are.
If I can take the privilege, I want to one thing you said about the consequences, having to weigh out the consequence. One other thing that sprung to mind is that often we have conflicting requirements. So for instance, there is one requirement which is becoming bigger and bigger of resilience. So you want your infrastructure to be resilient in the face of a changing climate or whatever. And on the other end, you want to have net zero carbon emission. And if you look at what it costs for HS2 to take into account, we're still at design stage, but if you want to take into account the resilience requirements that were set in the tender, like the amount of water that you have to be able to store underneath the underground construction, that translates into cubic meters of concrete, which is a really high carbon footprint. So sometimes you have very conflicting issues, and I think that resilience is an issue, and net zero carbon is a very good issue, and then you have to think what is the cost of going towards one direction or another. So I think that at the end, it is for the scientist and for the researcher to quantify, and as Giorgia said, clarify, not simplify, because things are not simple, and it is for the policymaker, that is for us as a society, to make the political decision, because not all decisions can be kept together all the time. I don't think so. Another thing is about for Andrea, because I'm old enough to have experienced the 1980 earthquake, and have been there helping out with others, and then the L'Aquila earthquake a couple of decades or maybe more later, and to be completely shocked by the totally different competence of the civil protection. So in 1980, the civil protection was not there. When the L'Aquila earthquake happened, the civil protection was there with a very good structure. So this is reassuring. But that is for the emergency, for dealing with the emergency afterwards. And I know that there is a lot of technical work there also. I'm not just saying this is organization and management. But I was very interested by this, time scale, real time, delayed time. What is a real-time warning system? Do we really have the ability to do that, say, particularly with a type of risk like the seismic risk, which in Italy is very important. We organized last year with two summers ago, with Jesus College, a summer school in the Marche that was called Living with Earthquakes. So where you wanna, you have to live with it, and you have to find, so for you particularly, because of the line of work in which you are, it is very important. And in Italy, scientists haven't just been sacked because they got it wrong. They have been jailed because they got it wrong. So, it's can be jailed, condemned. So I would like your point of view on that.
I will start from, the last thing you were saying before the question. In order to have, I was going really fast, in order to have like a real quantitative analysis of the user needs, what we have done in the last 5 years, it was going through the national implementation about like a European Framework Directive and seeing which are the needs that can be quantified, and then which are the requirements of the users, and then we set up like a scientific scheme to quantify in order to have like prioritization. So based on that, then we were also looking to what is, an operational system. How can we define an operational system and a real time and, and delay time? So it depends on, of course, on the hazard. When we talk about like seismic, we cannot say that is a real time. It's way much different between like hydrological hazard or tsunami hazard and so on. So it's easier to have like a real time operational system. Also using satellite, that is the key part of using that. Still the discussion, INGV with the new president was really looking forward to make a sort of like a ETILA alert on seismic. I still keep personally that is not a good way of communicating, because I don't think we will never have operational real-time hazard. It's different, and that's why I was saying to Giorgia that it's an on-demand operational services. That's feasible. It's on demand. It happened, and then I can have some interferograms and so on that allow me to better understand what could be later on happening, but it's not a real time. So it's for some specific hazard, I don't think we will never get there, or maybe we are not yet ready to get there. And the point is that the good part is that civil protection is becoming a structured network, and I'm happy to say that also the environmental protection system, it's becoming a network, and this helps in doing not real time but at least on demand service.
No, I got so carried away that I didn't realize that we are out of time, but maybe I should allow at least one question from the audience. There you go.
About all both projects, in reality are big data projects. For example, in the area of construction, you cannot consider, let's say, the, let's say, the railway construction in London as individual and satellite. We need to consider also, for example, they have done a lot of data, McKinsey has done underground observation data to understand the process of what will happen. So a combination of both. On the second question, I want to ask you, yes, we are involved with, for example, Australia. Australia is coming with the idea of disaster with the Open Data Cube. It is something that we are also facing, some kind of horizontal 2020. So if we have a system or something that you can get all data inside in an infrastructure, and with a higher performance computing and advanced tools, this means you can start really using the data for different, let's say, objectives. So the data is not the data are there. Then much better is with Earth observation and satellite and other type of other source of data, because you don't have just only one Earth observation. You have many data from different sources of Earth observation. In reality, you can build this nearly real-time forecasting technology. Thank you.
I start to answer because if you look to Copernicus, this infrastructure where you can get all the data plus the crunching numbers are already setting up. They are being called DIAS, Data Infrastructure Service Access System, where also universities can go there, they can find all the data, also the in situ data. They pay, you know, a small, it's a sort of like Amazon style of like having all the data there, and then you can do your research and so on. What the European Commission is trying to get with the, you know, with Copernicus, but with the new regulation about like the space that is now together with like space and defense, the new regulation will be space and defense. It's really making something similar to Google. We call the whale paradigm. In Google, you have like a whale that is eating all the type of information, and you can find all the type of information there, and you go there and you do your processing. But we are running after Google or Amazon. So my question is like, are we, you know, clever enough, or are we intelligent to go after Google or Amazon? Why we don't, you know, build up something different? It's we call the marketplace. It's way much better than to build just an infrastructure to make a marketplace with like a way of producing information more than a structure where to put information. That's what we are discussing at European level. That was one of the first tentatives, but there's way much other project to do that now.
I don't know, just a small thing to add on the first part. Yes, on the use of data, of course, I just agree that is important, but we also, again, when we present, we tend to say we are doing this we are doing this new thing, so I fell for that as well. There are methods that are already in place, that they are, for example, predicting and giving a certain expectation of how much is going to be the damage of a certain structure because of a certain excavation. I'm talking about my specific expertise. Those methods have been based heavily on data already. And two aspects that I wanted, just one confirmation that yes, data is definitely important. The combination of data. Those tools have been based on the merging of experimental data, so data that come from laboratory tests, numerical data that comes from computational modeling and a series of parametric analysis, meaning that we analyze different cases, and we combine our, well, not now, there is also plenty of field data already available. So there is a big effort currently in research, and I'm done with that, in synergy of the use of data.
Perfect, Italian style. We close this session with at least 5 minutes delay. I'm sorry, I've been really, really bad at timekeeping.
Fantastic. I'd like to thank Professor Giulia Vigiani for kindly moderating this panel, and the speakers, Andrea Taramelli and Giorgio Giardina. We'll now break for coffee. We're only 5 minutes late, so please be back at 11:45. Thank you.
Stiamo parlando dello stesso telefono?
Perché un telefono
l'ha
scusami, di cosa
trovato
stiamo
Nicolò
parlando?
stamattina.
Cosa stiamo parlando?
Del telefono che hai perso, stiamo parlando dello stesso telefono che
Era di
Alessandro.
Alessandra. Alessandra ne ha perso uno. No,
No, ma
Alessandra.
c'è il nome del.
Adesso c'è Bucchi,
C'è il
giusto?
nome della
Bucchi, sì.
diva. Che ci sono
Metti la
scordato.
slide normale, per adesso prepara quella di Bucchi.
Non mettiamo Bucchi, tanto adesso non sta predicendo.
Ah sì, vabbè.
Io metterei diretto Bucchi, no?
Vabbè.
C'è il nome della diva e la foto anche, però il problema è che non la si può chiamare perché lei l'ha messo il telefono in lost mode. È il numero che lei l'emergenza per chiamarlo, non è che numero ha messo.
Più o meno sì, c'era da regolare i vari microfoni quando parlavamo insieme che stiamo di fare cose, ma più o meno si dovrebbe essere sentito tutto. Avevamo 8 persone in streaming, tanta roba.
Il successo, guarda che...
Sì, beh, vediamo.
Ma poi riusciamo anche a scaricarlo, la registrazione? Ci ha salvato?
Sto registrando anche
Ok.
questo tempo, però sul computer non su YouTube. Su YouTube anche dovrebbe rimanere credo, ma la qualità penso sia più bassa.
Faccio solo un editing e tagliare alcuni pezzi, sarebbe carino.
Sì, ma ti mando poi dopo tutto, poi tutti gli editing
Io
di
sto
cui
facendo tweeting a manetta.
grande. No, adesso è arrivato il mio ragazzo che sta usare una Leica e quindi se ne sta occupando lui perché io sono tipo pessimo e vabbè, se andiamo a prenderci un caffè però ce lo meritiamo.
Mi è piaciuto, no? Proprio, secondo me, è proprio quello che speravo, diciamo.
tua presentazione è già pronta.
Sì, secondo te la scrollo così o la metto sul pieno?
No, mettila sul pieno.
Metto sul pieno? Ok.
Temo che questi non funzionino. No.
Ah, quindi vado con... Però c'era un altro.
Adesso proviamo di nuovo. No, perché Giorgia stava... Questo dovrebbe adesso andare.
A parte che tanto io sto qui, quindi...
Vediamo se hai provato.
Che cosa?
No, vabbè, se sei...
Proviamo.
No. No, vabbè, se stai qui. Sa che sono senza tutti questi.
Tutto qua.
Vado. Aspetto un minuto. Se vuoi sì, grazie. Okay, I hope the coffee break was refreshing. It's my pleasure now to introduce the second keynote speaker of the day, Professor Massimiliano Bucchi. Professor Bucchi is Professor of Sociology of Science and Communication at the University of Trento, where he is also the director of the Master in Communication of Science and Innovation. He is a world expert in the sociology of science, and today he'll give a talk about the public perception and attitudes towards scientists in Italy, with the work he has done with the Observatory of Science and Technology, Observa. So I'd like to introduce Professor Bucchi. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here and a great honor. And already yesterday in the evening, I had the fortune of being able to discuss with some of the bright researchers here. It's always interesting for people like me studying science in society to know what's going on in science. Let me start from a stereotype that is common in many countries, but especially in Italy. I'm sure you have heard these stereotypes that Italians are scientifically illiterate And because of this, they are not interested, they are ignorant about the science, they are not interested. In some cases recently about issues like vaccination and climate, there's also been used this term anti-science, which is quite strong. In my field, this is called the deficit model, and it's been widely criticized starting here in the UK, particularly since the early 2000s, as a very ideological way of looking at science and public relationship. People are ignorant, and because they are ignorant, they are against, for example, GMOs, nuclear energy. I will come to this in a minute. If you wish, I mean, if you don't want to call this the deficit model, which is a term, as I said, which is used in our literature, you can call it I like what I know and I know what I like, which was, as you remember, was both the march here in Alice in Wonderland and Peter Gabriel with the Genesis in the 70s. Okay, let me show you some data which might surprise you in the face of this stereotype. The data come from this book. I have distributed a few copies to Jacopo. Maybe he can show it to you. This book is published every year in January by a foundation, a non-profit organization. It's called Observa Science in Society. And the first chapter in this, so it's a collection of data. If you know the word in figures by The Economist, it's something similar, but just about science and society. But the first chapter of the book, it's original data from what we call the Science and Technology in Society Monitor. So since 2003, so it's almost 20 years now, 17 years, we've been doing a yearly survey of public perception and attitude to science and technology on a representative sample of about 1,000 Italian citizens. And many of the questions we do a similar question or identical questions that our colleagues, you probably have heard about the Eurobarometer. The Eurobarometer has been done for almost 30 years about science and technology. Now, unfortunately, they have stopped doing the general one. But, for example, also here in the UK, the Wellcome Trust uses some of these questions. Or in the US, the Pew Foundation, which is the reference point for studies of public perception, particularly in this field. So let me start from, this is not from our monitor, but it's from Eurostat. And it's something that we should always keep in mind when we talk about Italy, and not just Italy, but other countries. 2 Italians out of 10, or 1 out of 50, if you wish, have never used the internet on a mobile device or on a desktop. So when we do all of our talks about, for example, the influence of social media or about the use of digital services to interact with public administration, these people are just out of the picture. These are gone. We don't know. What do they do? You see there is a big difference. We call these people techno-excluded. Of course, this number has been declining very rapidly, or not so rapidly for some countries. It used to be 4 out of 10 in Italy until 4 or 5 years ago. You see in some countries, like in the Scandinavian countries, this is almost non-existent. 1%, 2%, 4%. So let's keep this in mind as a background. Luckily, we can include these people in this 20% in our sample because we also do telephone surveys. So this is hopefully some good news. I mean, it depends always whether you want to see the half empty or the half full glass. Science literacy in Italy, are Italians so ignorant about the science? We've been asking, this is a set of questions, very simple questions about whether the sun is a planet, antibiotics kill both viruses and bacteria, electrons are smaller than atoms. that over the years at the European level, with all the limits, of course, of an indicator, but what matters is first the international comparison. Are Italians more ignorant than other Europeans? The answer is no. Actually, they do a little bit better than the average. But also the time series. It has been growing with some variations. And why it has been so, our best explanation, it is simply because the new generations are more educated at the general level. That's another important thing. We can do a lot of science communication, but the best predictor, we can do a lot of fancy things, Fame Lab or Researchers' Night. The best predictor of literacy, open attitude to science, is how much time you have spent in school. We should never forget this, not only in Italy, in general. Okay, this is science literacy. How do they get information about science and technology? Again, we are lucky to have a long time series. I won't spend much time with this. Obviously, there is more and more in recent years a trend about going to the web, blogs, social media. Daily newspaper obviously means also internet versions of daily newspapers. But again, let's not forget that particularly for the more aged people, television is still very important, for example. Again, let's not forget about the 20% who never used the internet. Some years ago, we thought, and we published a paper in a journal about this, we thought, but can we measure science literacy just by asking questions? Because we live, of course, in the age of digital media, at least for the 80% of Italians. And so when we talk about science as other issues, people are attracted. We know this by research, for example, on social media. If you post the same content with a different image, it may have a completely different success, for example. So we started, and of course we have to do this through a web version of our questionnaire, to ask people, can you recognize some images that are broadly related with science? Now, you can make your own test. I mean, of course, one is very easy here in Cambridge. And it's actually very interesting. I'm originally trained in the history of science, as you know. This image was drawn by an artist, by the wife of Francis Crick. He described how he thought about it, and she drew it. Anyway, this is what we asked. And another interesting indicator, an Italian financial newspaper, Il Sole 24 Ore, asked us, could you give us these images and maybe a little bit more? So we put it on our website. And they had 30,000 responses in a few hours, which you will never get with the social science survey, obviously. So people like images, and actually they do quite well recognizing not just the structure of DNA or the periodic table of elements, but also an early portrait of Marie Curie, which 2/3 of Italians recognize. So we put all this together, and we came up, this is one of the possible conclusions, that if you compare scientific literacy with what we call visual science literacy, and this is the people, the percentage of respondents who get all the items incorrect. If you use only visual science literacy, it goes almost to 0. So people do much, much better at recognizing images. Now, does it mean that if they recognize the face of Albert Einstein or Marie Curie, they know about the science? Obviously not. What it means is there's a window of opportunity, for example, for science communicators. There's a window of attention. Then, of course, you have to fill with content. Okay, this is for scientific literacy. But let me come, and this is about exposure to science and technology in the media, as I said already, as I mentioned already, is just a bit more elaborated. Another interesting trend is that people go more and more to science events, go to visit science museums and exhibitions. You see, it had almost doubled within the last 10 years. And it's still, of course, relatively limited. It's about 10% of the population, but the increase is remarkable. And so going, for example, to science festivals, like in Edinburgh, for example, in the UK, or Cheltenham, or in Italy, Festival della Scienza di Genova, it's a great success. So people like to go to these events, and we will see this again in a minute, because it also reflects on the relationship with researchers. But of course, then, we should never forget, again, there's a nice paper in the journal Public Understanding of Science, which I had the honor of being the editor for 3 years, about the disengaged in science communication. We should never forget for example, the 60% of people who never go to a science museum. So this remains a big problem in science communication. More and more, by and large, it is preaching to the converted. So people who go to science museums are obviously more motivated than the average person. But what about those who never go? Why do they never go? Because it's expensive, it's too far, because they're not interested. We don't know almost anything about these people. Let me come to a critical point these days, the credibility and quality of information. Now, as we all know, we used to live in a world, we could call it science communication 1.0, where credibility of information was basically established through the brand. It's on the BBC, it's in the Science Museum, it's in Il Corriere della Sera. It must be interesting, it must be trustworthy, something we can trust. But how do we do it with the internet or social media? And this is quite interesting. On top, when we ask people, but what is the most reliable source when it comes to information about science and technology? It's go to listen to a researcher. So without mediation, without filters, listening to researchers or websites of research institutions, which again is an interesting trend. Of course, it can be critical as well. What do I find on the web page of CERN? Do I find the state of the art of particle physics or the self-promotion of their own activities? You see, the problem of quality of science communication is not just the accuracy, it's the independence, for example. There are many dimensions. But this is what Italians think. Social network profiles, of course, television. We have in Italy, we have an icon like Piero Angela that has practically invented science on television. Of course, this has some influence on this. Now, question of credibility. Are Italians distrustful of science and scientists? I wouldn't say so. Scientists are, and have been for many years, the top category when we compare with citizen committees, priests, journalists, politicians. This is not unique to Italy, and you wouldn't believe it. This is even true of America in the Trump, or United States in the age of Trump. This is the last data from Pew Foundation in the US. So this is the confidence which has been increasing, the confidence in scientists compared to religious leaders, news media, business leaders, and elected officials, especially when it comes to the question, do they act in the interest of the public? So it is not true, according to all the data we have, that there is a crisis of trust between society and science. This, of course, doesn't mean there is not a crisis between science and politics, because we know, unfortunately, that more and more political leaders, they think, we have examples of this, they think they can do without the expert advice, or that any expert advice is good, provided it suits their agenda. But that is another thing. We cannot generalize about society. When we ask about attitudes for sociologists, for social scientists, are something more stronger, no? and more elaborate. The attitudes to science are generally positive. Of course, there is an ambivalence, because we know that, well, first of all, society is not homogeneous, but also the applications of science and technology are very different, no? I've always found it difficult to answer myself the question, are the implications of science positive? Well, it depends. It depends which applications, it depends on which contexts. So for example, 70% think that science and technology are changing our lifestyles too quickly. But overall, 80% think that the benefits of science outweigh the potential risks. And this, again, it's in the Eurobarometer, it's in international results. But now let me come with, so this is the end of the good news. And let me come to what I see as much more critical. Now, when we ask citizens, yes, you read sometimes, you care about science and technology news, but what is the topic that you're mostly interested in? And on top, as you would expect, 31% say medicine and health. Now, if you are already thinking about vaccinations, you should count out up to 10 or maybe up to 4. 4% is the number of Italians who oppose all sorts of vaccination, who think that no vaccination should be compulsory. There's been a sharp decline after the reintroduction of obligatory vaccination, and probably, of course, we cannot say about cause and effects in the social sciences, maybe also in other sciences, I don't know, but also because there has been a lot of news about children who have died, people who have become sick because of vaccination. So again, let's not forget this. But I'm sure now you have a question in your mind that you have read a lot of posts by people against vaccination. But we should take into account two things. First of all, that this minority is probably a very vocal minority, especially in social media. And second thing, this comes from media studies, which is not my field, but it's a field I have to study for my research. We should never overestimate the relationship between what people watch, share, or post and what they actually do, particularly when it comes to something so critical. So the fact that people may share or put a like on a post, but then when it comes to vaccinating their child, they seem to think twice. And we have, okay, this is another element on vaccination. You see already, you see, for example, 50% think it's important to have compulsory vaccination because this, otherwise other children will be in danger, and another 33%, the benefits of vaccines always outweigh the potential risks. When we ask the question, but when it comes to decide about vaccination, what are your reliable sources? Can you spot social media where it is? Between 3 and 4%. So there's a lot of noise, but when it comes to this, people seem very cautious. I go to a general practitioner or pediatricians. So I promise some bad news, and you'd say, where is the bad news so far? Well, it is that more and more what we see consistently over recent years is the spread of DIY attitudes to health. So maybe not not with regard to vaccination so much, at least recently, but in general, people feel more and more that and this is a macro change in most industrialized countries, that health is not anymore about not being sick, but it's about well-being. You can think about aesthetic surgery, you can think about integrators, yes, all sorts of things. And it's up to me to manage my health. In Italy, we have this slogan, la salute è mia e me la gestisco io, which comes from feminist tradition. Anyway, a very interesting thing for us is that the do-it-yourself is less frequent among older respondents and less educated respondents. The people who think, I can deal with my own health, are the more educated. It's 2/3 of those with a university degree. It's those with high scientific literacy. It's exposure to science. So once again, repeat with me, it's not because people don't know about the science. It's for other reasons. And even the 4% anti-vaccination, people with high income, highly educated. Homeopathy, same thing. Okay, what do they do when, as you can imagine, they go to the pharmacy, they look for a solution on the internet. I addressed some of these questions. I thought, well, let's do it in a way that is not so boring. So I imagined a dialogue about science and society with my father, and I published it as my last editorial in this journal. So if you wish, you can read it. It's open access, and you will find many of the themes I have been discussing here. And let me finish by showing very briefly what we try to do in my university. We have started a couple of years ago. This is the second edition, a new Master in Communication of Science and Innovation. Remember well, of course, it's in the context of all of these challenges, but particularly, if you remember, there is more and more attention to to the communication the researchers and research institutions do in the first person by citizen. And we know with the third mission, with public engagement here in the UK, there is a pressure on researchers and research institutions to communicate with the public. But it's not so easy. It's a new responsibility. Are research institutions and researchers prepared to communicate with the public, particularly when the issues are so sensitive? So we train 10 people, it's all in English, every year, that can work in research institutions, innovation centers to deal with the strategies of public engagement. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Bucchi. That was such a fascinating talk. I have 100 questions, but I'm sure from the audience there's a lot of curiosity. So if anyone would like to ask a question, then go ahead.
Okay. Does it work? Can you hear me? Okay, my question is about the dimension of the samples, because I noticed that in 2011 you had 10,000 people asking this question, or is it wrong? Because
No,
and then you had 1,000, 900, 700, and so on and so forth. My question was about, have you checked different age groups or regional groups? Because on 1,000 people, maybe 20 region, then it's difficult to understand if there are parts of Italy that are particularly keen to low science profile, or I was amazed by the number of people. Is that the number analyzed, or was my mistake?
No, this is not 10,000. I mean, we couldn't afford it. It's 1,000, which is considered a representative sample of Italian population. So we have a confidence error of about 2 or 3%. So for each of the results that I have showed you, the reason why sometimes it is 1,005, 997 is that we start it has to be balanced, exactly as you say, by age, by gender, and by macro area of residence, which means that we can tell you what do people think in the Northeast or in the South, but we cannot tell you what they think in Sicily.
Thank you.
Of course, if we had more funding, we could do a bigger sample. But overall, statistically, is the typical sample that we use for social research. We used to do it all by telephone for the reason I have showed you. But then gradually we introduced, so now we do 60% telephone and 40% web. We do this very cautiously, and we checked there were not relevant differences in the sample.
Any other question?
And also let me emphasize, maybe I haven't said that, it's not a panel, so it's not the same people every year. It's the same time of sample. Why don't we do a panel? A panel is more convenient economically, as you know, but it is because if you ask the same people similar question or question, they will look at the information in a different way, and we don't want that.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Elena. It is very interesting and reassuring to see this data. We all are on Facebook and on social media, and you see how certain news, especially on public health, spread quite uncontrolled. And it's nice to see that when people come to their health, they think twice and they take.
About vaccination.
Yeah, that's fine.
About other health, like
yeah.
For example, diets. I couldn't say. I
Yeah.
couldn't say because we don't have the data.
Because you're in the area, I'm a scientist. Why do you think people like to give a different idea of what is their thinking compared to then what type of decision they take? So if I say that why would I go on a social media and be very, very, not very thoughtful about saying I'm against this particular vaccination or I'm an anti-vax, and then thinking twice when it comes to their health? And the second question is, we are here because it's science and policy, but the impact of bad news we know is devastating on social media. How can scientists make a good voice, and how can we do this in Italy? Because the anti-vax movement is quite strong. Where are all the scientists? Why we don't take the same approach that all these people are taking to spread the bad news, and we replicate by spreading the good news?
Well, let me start with the second question. I think that's a very good point, but it's a question to be discussed with the scientists. No, I can. A few years ago, and I hope we will do it again, we did a study of the attitudes of scientists towards public communication. And what came out was there was a great difference of attitudes. So there are scientists who like and want to be engaged and prepared to take the challenge. But when we created, with the cluster analysis, a typology, one type was called, "Leave me alone, I have to work." Which you laugh, and I may also laugh, but I think we should respect this position, that it cannot be an obligation for scientists to communicate. No? So provided those who don't engage, they recognize the fact that other scientists are doing it, or the institution are doing it. And for example, it should be valued for their career. And this is one of the reasons why we created this master, to train people that a scientist who has an interesting research can go to one of these people in the department or university and devise a strategy on different media. First question, why do people say one thing on Facebook and then they act in a different way? Well, we could talk for years. And I'm not, my colleague Giuseppe Veltri is an expert on this. I'm not an expert with social media. But there are several reasons, because you don't feel responsible for what you say, no? Because you don't think it's the same thing as saying, many people say on social media things they would never say in the face in a conversation. And then I think, of course, for the big tech corporation, this is a question they don't like to address, no? But if you wish to paraphrase Shakespeare, what's in a like? What does it mean if I put a like? No? Does it mean I share fully what this person has said? Or it means, maybe for some of my students, it's just, I have taken notice, no? And so on. So this, I think we should be very, very careful to draw inferences from what people say. I mean, all in all, we've always had gossip, for example, in small villages, no? But it's not because you say something very negative a person, luckily, that you go out and then kill this person or fight, actually, with this person. So I think we still know too little about the relationship between, also, again, this is not my field, also when it comes to political votes and decisions, no? Making the equation, you have read this, then you're going to vote in a certain way. This has never been true for television, for the print media, for social media. But of course, there are challenges. There's an enormous challenge for citizens to deal with the quality of information, which is not just accuracy. And I don't like the term fake news. But of course, there is a question with the quality of information there. But it's also a challenge for researchers, because people are very interested in, for example, going to the social, to a Facebook page of a visible scientist. But we have several examples of visible scientists who have said stupid things totally outside of their domain. So the New Scientist had a very funny article some years ago about all the quotes that Einstein never said. The social media are full of things, including the famous quote on bees. I'm sure you have read that, no? That when bees disappear, mankind will be in threat. Einstein never said that. He said a lot of things, but never cared about bees. So, and of course, why do they do this? Because the equation is, a scientist has said that, it's scientific. But this is not true. This is a wrong equation. So we should be very careful with this.
Thank you, Professor Bucchi. I'm afraid there's no more time for further questions, but he'll be here over lunch, so you can bug him then. Thank you. So the next session will be poster authors presenting, having 1 minute to pitch their poster just before we break for lunch. So can I invite the poster authors to come and sit here at the front while we set up the slides? Dov'è il drive? Dobbiamo scaricarli. Sì, sì, perfetto. Mi aiutate col drive, please? Come faccio ad andare? Vado qua. Ok.
Le persone parlano da qua, quindi?
Yes. Tu puoi tenere un minuto?
Sì.
Ok. Right. Michele. Where are we? This one. Can I have a controller here? How do I full screen this? Sì. Okay, the first speaker will be Michele Mack. I'll leave the floor to you. I think your poster should be coming up in a second. It doesn't like your poster. Oh, now it does. Let me see if I can slideshow it. Here we are.
Thank you. My name is Michele Mack. I'm based in the Department of Engineering here at Cambridge, and my research is about concrete bridges and the fact that they deteriorate and lose strength over time. Now, assessing their residual strength with accuracy is very challenging, and this leads to very high costs of maintenance, repair, or even collapses in extreme cases. Identifying priorities is crucial when we manage if we want to manage the infrastructure network efficiently. And for this, we've seen this morning, we have the help of new and powerful technologies such as drones, sensors, and satellites. But we need to translate all the data that they collect into something that's useful and meaningful to inform decisions. We need underpinning scientific theories to quantify problems and identify priorities. So that's what I'm doing with my research. I'm developing a new approach to the assessment of concrete bridges that are deteriorating. And this approach is trying to link the damage and the cracks that you can measure on the outside of a bridge with the residual strength with a bit more accuracy that we could do before. And this hopefully will contribute to the development of more safer, more sustainable, and resilient infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michele. I'm just going to download all of them so we don't. The next speaker will be Jasmine Allegra Anuna. Did I pronounce that correctly? Thank you. Fantastic. And I'm just loading your poster. Here we are.
Digital innovation. To some of us here, this might mean fancier, smarter tech. But to me, it means getting smarter about the ways we interact with them and understanding the sociological implications of networks we're creating, specifically social networks. Though there is still a general hostility and negativity towards social media, I believe it's equally crucial to understand its positive implications. And a really powerful example of this is the way that certain projects on social media in Italy, specifically feminist projects, disrupt traditional social systems to reimagine new and more inclusive ones. And social media projects are successfully used around the world as a complement to offline activism. And today, I urge you all to think of how it can complement your own industries, studies, fields. I challenge you all to set aside any fear or prejudice you might have towards social networks. I challenge you to take advantage of the unique creative possibilities that the online dimension can open for us all in our shared quest for peace, equality, and innovation. Researchers use it to share your work. Educators include it in your curricula, and policymakers use it to develop more transparent policy. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Assunta Baratta.
Hi. How will the university of the future be? Why the Italian university is not open to use of new technology? These are the very important questions. So the studies focused on the Bologna process, on the European higher education area, on the perspective of learning on student needs, technological influence, and the quality assurance system. 2, a comparative analysis in the higher education system in Italy and UK. The perspective of learning is extraordinary flexibility on the learning, where lessons are taken by students using a laptop, an iPad, an iPhone with just-in-time lesson, where you can get lesson on state-of-the-art just in time. What do I highlight in my comparative analysis between Italy and the UK? So I think the most important issue is evaluation of the learning quality assessment. The evaluation of online didactics, which regard not only online university, but all university, all degree, all course of study. The evaluation of learning is a central issue for a quality assurance. For the reason, I have made the policymaker recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The next one on is Laura Convertino.
I focus on psychedelic drugs. Psychedelics are considered to be really dangerous and harmful all over the world. Since the 60s, they have been considered or legally recognized as illegal in most of the countries of the world, despite the fact that both before the 1960s and more recent research is proving the possibility to use them in order to treat several psychiatric and neurological disorders that are still lacking valuable treatments. So in my poster, I went through the history of the regulation that internationally are making so difficult for us to actually do research on psychedelic drugs. And I proposed a new way to reschedule them outside Schedule 1 drugs that are the most difficult to study in order to be able to use them in medicine and more broadly in research. Thank you.
That was 58 seconds. Well done. The next speaker will be Lucas Gast. I think I've already done one of yours. Very good. You were there.
Perfect, thank you. The production of materials like steel, aluminium, and cement is increasing globally. These materials are needed for building buildings, railway systems, and tunnels, as we've heard earlier. These production processes do not only lead to carbon dioxide emissions, but also to lots of other liquid and solid byproducts. In my PhD, I'm looking at these industrial waste products and how to recycle them in the best possible way. For this poster, I compared different articles on waste management in Italy. Let me give you some numbers. In Italy, per year, 164 million tons of municipal solid waste and construction waste are being produced. This is more than 2 Fiat Puntos per person per year. In addition to that, there are 2 Ferraris being produced of industrial waste, which is currently not being accounted for. So I compared different case studies and the best practice examples of so-called industrial symbiosis to reduce the waste and use it in different ways and as part of a circular economy strategy. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and the discussions downstairs. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lucas. The next speaker is Giovanni Giustini.
Hello, I am Giovanni Giustini. I am a research associate in the can you hear me? In the mechanical engineering department at Imperial College. My research focuses on numerical modeling of the thermohydraulics behavior of light water cooled nuclear reactors, and my poster is about energy policy and in particular nuclear power. And of course we all know that in Italy we do not have any nuclear power. However, we really do need to decarbonize our provision of electricity. Clearly, nuclear power represents a very attractive opportunity. I'm not here to solve all of our energy problems, so my goal for today is to start up a conversation, meet downstairs in front of my poster, and perhaps, take it to the next step and talk about nuclear in a very open and honest way. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Giovanni. And I think the last speaker is Corrado Mazzaglia. Where is that? I'm so confused. Oh, there you go. Sorry. Oh, what's going on? Okay, good. There you go.
Thank you and good afternoon. As the title of the poster says, the aim of my project is to create an artificial 2D bioprinted lymph node to study the role of this immune system organ in cancer and progression of metastasis. Lymph nodes physiologically are considered as immunological hubs, and they defend us from pathogens and diseases. But it's been recently shown that in many solid tumors, they undergo several alterations that are still poorly understood that actually help cancer cells to spread. This is not understood, and also this is because of the current available tools. In fact, in vitro models not recapitulate the high complexity of the microenvironment of the disease, and in vivo models not only bring many bioethical issues, but also give only partial data. So in this context, what I want to do is to create a new and more complex dynamic in vitro model to study the basic factors of this disease, and in the future perhaps use it as well for drug testing and reduce the use of animal experiments. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all poster authors. It's now time to break for lunch and to start up discussions in front of the posters. So we'll be back here, I think, at 1:40. Thanks very much. Va bene?
Twitter stiamo facendo un engagement
Ah sì? Tipo 4 persone?
No, 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 su Twitter un sacco di retweet, like.
I bicchieri d'acqua vanno cambiati, va bene, possiamo dirlo a qualcuno che non sono io. Sto andando bene? Non sono successi. Sì, io ho pensato solo di metterlo perché così vedono qual è, solo per quello. Però sì, hai ragione, anche una slide sarebbe stato forse meglio.
L'importante è che ora vanno a vedere i poster. Che comunque è stato buono per contestualizzare in maniera...
Ma quanto interessante, troppo interessante quello che dici.